Water gives life, and water takes it away. For the entire span of human existence, 200,000 years of our species walking this earth, floods have been one of the most consistent and catastrophic forces that ancient humans had to face. Not occasionally, not as rare disasters, routinely, seasonally, as a predictable and recurring feature of life near rivers, coastlines, and floodplains, which is exactly where most ancient humans chose to live, because water sources were everything. Rivers meant drinking water. Rivers meant fish. Rivers meant fertile soil deposited by seasonal flooding that grew crops better than anywhere else. The same rivers that fed entire civilizations were the same rivers that, when they rose too high, swept those civilizations away. And yet ancient humans survived. They adapted. They developed strategies, structures, technologies, and social systems sophisticated enough to keep their communities alive through floods that, by our modern estimates, were sometimes dramatically larger than anything we would consider manageable today. Today, we are going to look at exactly how they did it, from the earliest prehistoric flood survivors through the great ancient river civilizations to the extraordinary engineering achievements that allowed cities to exist in flood-prone environments thousands of years before modern infrastructure existed. This is the story of humans versus water. And for most of history, it was closer than you might think. Before we get into strategies and solutions, we need to understand the scale of what ancient humans were actually dealing with. Because when we say ancient floods, we are not talking about a flooded basement or an overflowing creek. The last great ice age ended approximately 12,000 years ago, and as the massive ice sheets that covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia, global sea levels rose by roughly 120 meters over several thousand years. That is nearly 400 feet of sea level rise, enough to permanently submerge enormous areas of coastal land that had previously been inhabited by human populations for tens of thousands of years. Entire coastlines that ancient humans had lived on, hunted across, built communities on, and almost certainly had cultural and spiritual connections to, simply disappeared under rising ocean water over the course of a few thousand years. This was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, relentless, multi-generational process of loss that ancient communities had to respond to, adapt to, and survive across many generations. On top of this long-term sea level rise, ancient river systems, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River in China, experienced dramatic seasonal floods that were, in some years, far more severe than the average. The Yellow River in ancient China was called China's Sorrow, a name that tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between early Chinese civilization and flood events. The Nile's annual flood was the foundation of Egyptian agriculture. When it came at the right level, it deposited rich silt across the floodplain, and the harvest was extraordinary. When it came too high, it swept away everything. Ancient humans lived in this world every single day, and they developed responses that were, given the tools available to them, genuinely impressive. The first and most fundamental strategy ancient humans used to survive floods was one that required no technology at all. They watched. Prehistoric hunter-gatherer communities, living in close and constant relationship with their natural environment, developed detailed observational knowledge of seasonal patterns that gave them advance warning of coming flood conditions, the timing of snowmelt in upstream mountains, the specific patterns of rainfall across different seasons, the behavior of animals, certain bird species moving to higher ground before river levels rose, fish behavior changing as upstream conditions altered, insects behaving differently before weather systems arrived. This knowledge was not written down. It was accumulated across generations, held in oral tradition, and passed carefully from older community members to younger ones as some of the most vital practical knowledge a person could possess. Modern anthropologists studying surviving traditional communities in flood-prone regions of Asia and Africa have documented remarkable examples of this generational flood knowledge in action. Following the catastrophic Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, indigenous communities in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, who maintained ancient oral traditions about what to do when the ocean behaved in unusual ways, moved to high ground before the event, and survived with dramatically fewer casualties than neighboring communities that lacked this traditional knowledge. Ancient humans did not have weather satellites or river gauges. They had something equally valuable in its own way: the accumulated observational wisdom of many generations of people watching the same rivers, the same seasons, and the same warning signs. When observation told you that a flood was coming, the next strategy was the one that prehistoric mobile communities were particularly well equipped for: movement. Hunter-gatherer communities were, by definition, not permanently attached to fixed locations in the way that agricultural settlements later became. They moved seasonally, following food resources, water sources, and favorable conditions. This mobility, which is sometimes characterized as a limitation of prehistoric life compared to settled civilization, was actually an enormous adaptive advantage when dealing with flood events. A community that could pack up and move to higher ground within hours or days was a community that could survive almost any flood, regardless of its severity. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. Studies of prehistoric settlement patterns in river valleys across Europe, Asia, and the Americas show that early communities consistently chose site locations on elevated ground above river floodplains, not because elevated sites offered other advantages over floodplain locations, specifically because the positioning provided safety from seasonal flood events while still maintaining proximity to the river's resources. These communities understood the distinction between close enough to benefit from the river and close enough to be swept away by it. They drew that line carefully, and they drew it in the landscape. The transition to agriculture, beginning roughly 12,000 years ago, changed this equation dramatically. Farming communities needed to stay in one place across seasons and years to tend their crops, store their harvests, and maintain their fields. The adaptive flexibility of mobility was gradually replaced by the adaptive challenge of permanence. And permanence, in flood-prone environments, required a completely different set of solutions. The ancient civilizations that emerged in the great river valleys of the world, Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley civilization in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, and the early Chinese dynasties along the Yellow River, all share one remarkable commonality. They were built in places that flooded regularly, and they survived and thrived there for thousands of years by developing flood management strategies of extraordinary sophistication. Mesopotamia, the region of modern-day Iraq, was the birthplace of some of the earliest known flood engineering in human history, and the scale of what early Mesopotamian communities achieved is remarkable given the tools and materials they had available. The earliest Mesopotamian flood management systems, dating to before 3000 BC, consisted of networks of earthen levees, raised banks of compacted earth, built alongside river channels to contain rising water levels within the riverbed and direct flow away from settled areas. These were not small or simple structures. Archaeological surveys have identified levee systems in ancient Mesopotamia that ran for dozens of kilometers, involved the movement of enormous quantities of earth, and required coordination across entire regional communities to build and maintain. The construction of these levees required organized labor on a scale that influenced the development of early Mesopotamian social and political structures. Coordinating hundreds or thousands of workers across a large engineering project requires leadership, planning, resource allocation, and communication systems. Some historians have argued that the practical necessity of large-scale flood management infrastructure was one of the primary drivers behind the emergence of organized governance and administrative systems in early Mesopotamian society. The need to work together against the flood may have been one of the things that pushed early human communities toward a more complex social organization. Ancient Mesopotamian communities also developed sophisticated canal systems that served double duty, channeling river water to irrigate agricultural fields during dry seasons and directing excess water away from settled areas during flood events. These systems required precise understanding of water flow, slope gradients, and the behavior of water under different conditions, engineering knowledge that was accumulated empirically over many generations and eventually formalized in early technical records. Ancient Egypt's relationship with the Nile flood was perhaps the most sophisticated in the ancient world, not because Egypt tried hardest to stop the flood, but because Egyptians understood something that took other civilizations much longer to grasp. The annual flood was not just a threat to be managed. It was the foundation of the entire civilization's agricultural prosperity, and the goal was not to prevent it, but to work with it. The Nile's annual flood, called the inundation and known in ancient Egyptian as akhet, deposited a layer of rich, dark, nutrient-dense silt across the entire floodplain as it receded each year, effectively fertilizing an enormous agricultural area automatically without any human effort. Egyptian farmers planned their entire agricultural calendar around this event. They planted immediately after the floodwaters receded, into soil that was already perfectly prepared by the flood itself, and harvested before the next year's flood arrived. The Egyptian solution to flood management was therefore not primarily about keeping water out. It was about precision timing, infrastructure for storing and distributing the flood's benefits, and monitoring systems sophisticated enough to predict what kind of flood was coming each year so communities could prepare accordingly. The Nilometer, a measuring instrument installed at key points along the Nile, dating back to at least 3000 BC and possibly earlier, was used to measure the Nile's water level at the beginning of the flood season and predict whether that year's flood would be beneficial, insufficient, or dangerously excessive. Ancient Egyptian officials recorded Nilometer readings across centuries, building a long-term database of flood patterns that allowed increasingly accurate seasonal predictions. This may be the world's earliest systematic environmental monitoring program, a flood prediction database maintained by a government thousands of years before modern hydrology existed as a scientific field. Ancient China's experience with flood management was perhaps the most dramatic and historically consequential of any civilization, because the Yellow River, the cradle of Chinese civilization, was also one of the most unpredictable and dangerous rivers on Earth. The Yellow River gets its name from the enormous quantities of yellow silt it carries, more than any other river in the world. This silt deposits on the riverbed as the water slows, gradually raising the river's floor over time until, in some stretches, the river actually flows above the level of the surrounding land, contained only by its own built-up banks. When those banks fail, the river does not simply overflow its banks like a typical flood. It can shift its course entirely, sometimes by hundreds of kilometers, inundating vast regions with catastrophic and essentially unpredictable floods. Chinese historical records document the Yellow River changing its main course multiple times across recorded history, each time causing floods of regional or near civilizational scale. The legendary response to this challenge is one of the most famous stories in Chinese cultural history. The story of Yu the Great, said to have lived around 2100 BC, who spent 13 years developing and implementing a flood control system for the Yellow River that saved Chinese civilization from devastating annual floods. The method attributed to Yu was revolutionary in its insight. Rather than building walls to hold the floodwater back, an approach that his predecessor had tried and that had failed, Yu focused on dredging and channeling the river, giving the water places to go, rather than trying to stop it from going anywhere. Whether Yu the Great was a real historical figure or a legendary representation of a genuine engineering tradition that developed across generations, the approach attributed to him, working with the flow of water rather than against it, reflects a principle of flood management that modern hydraulic engineers recognize as genuinely sophisticated. The same principle underlies modern managed floodplain and flood relief channel design. The scale of ancient Chinese flood management infrastructure was extraordinary. The Dujiangyan irrigation system, built in Sichuan province in approximately 250 BC by the engineer Li Bing and his son, is one of the oldest hydraulic engineering projects in the world that is still fully operational today. It diverts the Min River to irrigate agricultural land while simultaneously managing seasonal floods, using a system of weirs, channels, and spillways that required no dam or blocking structure, but instead precisely directed and divided water flow to achieve both irrigation and flood management simultaneously. It has been in continuous operation for over 2,200 years. Beyond infrastructure and observation, ancient humans used one more powerful tool for flood survival that we sometimes overlook: story. Flood myths are among the most universal narratives in all of human cultural history. They appear in Mesopotamian texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest written stories, contains a detailed flood narrative that predates the biblical account of Noah and shares striking structural similarities. They appear in Hindu tradition, in ancient Greek mythology, in Chinese cultural history, in indigenous American oral traditions, and in the oral histories of cultures across Africa, the Pacific Islands, and Australia. The sheer universality of flood mythology, across cultures with no historical contact with each other, on every inhabited continent, has fascinated researchers for generations. One compelling interpretation, supported by a growing body of archaeological and geological research, is that many of these flood myths preserve genuine ancestral memory of real catastrophic flood events, particularly those associated with the dramatic sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Memories of coastlines swallowed by rising seas, of river valleys permanently inundated, of communities displaced by water, passed forward in story form across dozens of generations until they solidified into mythological narrative. If this interpretation is correct, flood myths are not just stories. They are some of the oldest surviving data about real historical events, encoded in the one format that can survive tens of thousands of years without writing, without paper, and without archaeology. The human story told around the fire, remembered by children, and passed on. So how did ancient humans survive floods? They watched the natural world with extraordinary attention and passed that knowledge down across generations. They maintained the mobility to move when moving was necessary. They built levees, canals, monitoring systems, and hydraulic engineering projects of remarkable sophistication, using only the tools of their era. They timed their lives around the flood's rhythms, rather than fighting those rhythms blindly. And they remembered, in story, in mythology, in oral tradition, what their ancestors had lived through, so that no community ever had to start completely from zero. What ancient flood survival tells us is something that applies well beyond floods. Human communities are most resilient when they pay attention, share knowledge across generations, work together on challenges that are too large for any individual, and find ways to live with the forces of nature rather than only against them. The water is still rising in many places. It has always been rising somewhere, and for 200,000 years, that has never been enough to stop us. If this gave you a new perspective on how ancient humans faced the natural world, subscribe and leave a comment below.